Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's summit, Mastering Hyperconvergence. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, enterprise cloud platform provider Nutanix, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor, Nutanix, has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. We would greatly appreciate it if you would share your opinions with us, honestly. Our editors read every comment, and they really do help us to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the 3rd session, one lucky attendee will be receiving an iPhone 13 with 256 gigabytes of storage. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Top Hyperconvergence Infrastructure Tips. For this session, we've called on 2 experts in the field, Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricoin Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with more than 2 decades of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communication networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. In his 2 decades plus in IT, John has held more roles ranging from software architect to senior executive consultant to author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He's developed technology training courseware for Pluralsight and authored material for both Thomson Reuters Aspitor books and Exec Blueprints. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Dave and John.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John, for the warm introduction as always, and welcome to all of our attendees for this wonderful summit on hyperconvergence. All right. So let's get right into the meat of the presentation here. And the first piece about hyperconvergence tips here is that, we're coming up into a very interesting time, in my opinion, with hyperconvergence. And the interesting time is the fact that now we're actually at the point where we're starting to refresh hardware. So a lot of customers and folks that I deal with in the field are at the point right now where they've got some type of hyperconverged platform inside of their infrastructure. And now they're looking to do more. It's not, was this a good platform for us, and is it going to stand up? Now it's lasted for its 60-month life cycle, and what are we going to do with it now at this point in time? And so we're seeing a lot of organizations right now growing their platforms, and with that growth comes some interesting opportunities for organizations. And one of those in particular is can you upgrade the old platforms? And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation. But I think that there's some good opportunities with that hardware to continue to leave it in play longer than that 60-month life cycle. So I guess bringing this back over to my dear friend, John O'Neill Sr. here. John, what are your thoughts about taking some of that existing hyperconverged infrastructure and repurposing it for our IT teams for either lab environments or potentially DR co-location facilities? Because even although that hardware might be off warranty, is there still some life that we can get out of it beyond that 5-year plan?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dave. I have a lot of thoughts about this. You and I are firm advocates of continuing education and keeping skills sharp for the team. And, we can do a lot of that in simulated environments, but sometimes there's just no substitute for a live environment, right? A live fire lab kind of thing. And it's like the Romans used to say, practice like it's war, and then war becomes practice. So, when we can take this hardware and we can build it up and tear it down and build it up and tear it down in lab environments for our team, they become, so much more well-rounded than just when they take online training or through books or even sit some of the exams. This fills in some of the real-world gaps that are always present in those kind of training. So, me, I'm a big fan of getting this into our lab environments and letting our teams, build it up from the ground up, tear it back down, and go at it again and again and again until it's just muscle memory.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other big pieces that I'm finding here as well, John, is the fact that procurement delays, and, this is an interesting question that I'll pose to the audience today. Are you seeing procurement delays in hardware over the last year, over 2021? It was awful for us. John, we went to go put in some hyperconverged clusters for customers, and, it was taking upwards of 4 to 5 months, and the delays were a variety of things. It was drives to processors, to memory, to just components, shipping delays. And so we've still seen a backlog inside of the channel, even getting gear. So one of the pieces of advice that I have in your plan for growth is, even if you're not going to put that gear into a lab environment, even if you're not going to put it into a DR environment, the ability for you to potentially get spare nodes or having a spare cluster kicking around could potentially be challenging for you. Now, this is one of the beauties of hyperconverged infrastructure. It doesn't take up a giant footprint. So I would actually store at least 1 to 2 of those spare clusters. We can box them back up. We can put them back in the storage room, wipe them back to factory config so they're ready to go. And, if the day ever comes where, you need to bring that back in short order, it's there for you, because I honestly believe that your ability to take and gain access to hardware quickly is very, very challenging in today's world. And along with that is, if you decide to just life cycle that gear and it's now gone, you have to, in your plans for growth, consider which workloads can potentially move to the cloud. Because, that procurement of saying, I want to go from 512 gigs of RAM to a terabyte of RAM per node, that's not just going to show up tomorrow. That's going to take some time to get into place. So it's really important that you plan for growth. Yes, John.
I just wanted to jump in here because, the tip you just gave is so important right now and for at least the next year, because supply chain is constrained. I mean, we've all seen it on the news and everything else. And so that's such a great tip you give. Now I want to build on that and give a second tip. You and I, of course, focus a lot on cybersecurity. It's where we've lived for the last couple of years. And as part of that, we've done a lot of work with cyber insurance policies and renewals. And, of course, those are changing rapidly. So one of the things that we're finding is common with underwriters in the fine print is, if you have hardware that is running that is not supported by the vendor, it creates an exclusion clause in the policy. So it's fine print, but it allows the insurance company to come back later. If you had a ransomware event that had nothing to do with that hardware at all, they could still deny the claim. So the way around that is if put it in your documented processes, put it in your playbook. If you need to put one of these workloads that's out of warranty back into production because you're in a procurement situation or a DR situation, just get a hold of your insurance company and have them give you a rider for that, an exclusion, right? It's better to do that on the front end than to find out on the back end that, some small black and white print of an obscure policy ends up biting you on a cybersecurity event. So, just communicate and have that as part of the plan.
Oh, you know what, John? This session's already paid for itself for me, because I hadn't even thought of that. And so that one tip alone is huge. I just learned something new here as well that I hadn't thought about, and I think that's pretty recent that you're going through that as well. So yeah, that's
absolutely
fantastic.
That just changed in the last few months, right?
Yeah.
We're just seeing it kind of coming into 2022. So thanks. You can take the rest. I'll take a nap.
Yeah, no worries. So the next piece of hyperconverged infrastructure is just some tips from, working with this over the past 60 months plus out in the field is, the variety of networking that we can have on node configuration. And, the traditional design inside of most modern data centers sees, two types of networks that we have. We've got east-west network that's typically for inter-data center traffic, and for hyperconverged infrastructure, we'd like to say that that's kind of our storage network. And then we've got north-south traffic. And north-south traffic is typically where our VM traffic or management traffic, IPMI, ILO-DRAC networks would live, where we're going to be taking and communicating from some other point in the network. And then the other two pieces of networking that we have to think about is, are we going to be going with converged infrastructure? So do we want to be creating a team and virtual adapters on top of that? And do we want to have, one set of 100 gig NICs inside of that server, and we're going to combine east, west, north, south together, create some VLANs, create some virtual adapters on top? Like, what is that design going to look like? And then the last piece is that over the last couple of years, I've seen switchless designs really take off, where, that east-west traffic, we can actually direct connect these nodes in a 2 or 3 node configuration and really eliminate a lot of the pieces and complexities behind the networking side of this. And I find for a lot of branch office and kind of SOHO designs, that switchless infrastructure is very popular, because then I really only have to worry about pinning up my hyperconverged infrastructure into, my corporate network with, the north-south configuration. This is a big piece, though, is that, from a tip perspective surrounding hyperconvergence, this is one of the areas, John, that I know you and I find that hyperconverged infrastructure can really fall flat on its face. And there's a couple of things that we've got to be very, very careful with inside of here when we build out HCI infrastructure. And it's more so surrounding the north-south traffic, the management interfaces that we have that are going to be stood up for hyperconverged infrastructure. And it's watching your VLANs and, how your servers and your networks are configured and presented. Because let's say that we've got a very flat VLAN structure for one of our networks, and we just want to throw in some hyperconverged infrastructure. Well, that cluster is going to need an IP address, and maybe there's not very good controls or gates for the networking team around, DHCP scopes and reservations. And what happens, John, when our networks start overlapping on top of one another, or we accidentally get some duplicate IPs? How nicely does that cluster play at that point in time?
Oh man, Dave, you just made me have flashbacks. I won't call them PTSD, but flashbacks to that time that you and I were dealing with a security event and denial of service situation, and the network is basically shut down with overrun traffic. And because they did not have that VLAN segregation you're talking about, it shut down everything, including the IPMI access and everything else. So we couldn't get to the host. We couldn't get to the out-of-band management interface. We couldn't get to anything that, a piece of malware basically got in there and did exactly what it intended to do and brought down every piece of the network. Whereas, a little bit of VLAN design, like you just suggested, and some effort to document and keep that management network separate from that production network. I know during that event and those lost hours of sleep and bags under our eyes that you and I were both wishing that had been done, that there had been that separate management network where we could get into that out of band interface and we could start working on the host and resolving problems there.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Okay, so the next piece that we're going to talk about for tips here is VM sizing and workloads. And this one here, I'm a really big fan of cleaning up infrastructure as we go. And just because you had something running on, even if it was on another HCI cluster, let's say you've got a brand new all-flash HCI cluster, whoa, that thing is shiny and it's fast. And, just because we have those workloads running in the old world, does it mean that there's a good place for it in the new world? And my answer to that is no. Every time you go through a migration, it's an opportunity to also do decommissioning as well. Just because that VM was running doesn't necessarily mean that it's even required anymore. You need to go back to your application support teams. You need to go back to the owners of those VMs, and you need to find out if they're even required. Maybe they went through a migration over the point of time in the last 2 to 3 years, and they just forgot to turn off a bunch of those VMs. From an infrastructure team, we see these as running artifacts that we need to keep online. We're red light, green light. It's running on the cluster. We need to make sure it stays running. We need to make sure it has connectivity, and we need to make sure it's backed up and protected. So my advice to everyone here today is don't be a data hoarder. You want to make sure that you do some type of rationalization as you're looking at your new hyperconverged projects for 2022. You want to make sure that, just because the VM is running inside of that infrastructure, does it even belong there anymore? And so that rationalization process for what goes into these clusters is huge, because I've seen so many projects where our PMs basically just look at the infrastructure and they say, oh, well, there's 100 VMs that are running in the old cluster. To have a successful project, we need to have 100 VMs running in the new cluster. And when we're done migrating 99 and on to 100 and that's done, the project's closed and, we're good to go. Well, in reality, you could have probably cut that number down to 75 or even 50, because maybe a lot of those things weren't needed. Maybe there was opportunity for consolidation. SQL consolidation, for example. Do you need to run 100 SQL servers in your infrastructure? Can you get away with 5 enterprise versions? You need to really think about what's going on to those clusters. And then the last piece before I hand this back over to you, John, for your thoughts, is I truly believe that dormant file servers, these things are the bane of my existence, John, because they're so big. They have so much data. And so what ends up happening is that if we follow our backup protection and DR rules with the 32100 whatever rules, we have to keep 3 copies of the backup on different mediums in different locations and everything. And so if I keep those old clusters around, even keeping a 1 terabyte cluster around, a 1 terabyte file server around, and it's not needed, well, I have to keep 3 copies of it. Okay, now I've got 3 copies of backup data. Oh, we need an immutable copy too. Oh, that's 4 terabytes. Oh, I want a cloud copy too. That's 5 terabytes of potentially wasted space in the back-end infrastructure for this thing. And it could maybe even be better served using something like Azure Files, offloading some of that up to the cloud, archiving that. And as long as it's available for the end users and consumers, like it's not gone, it doesn't necessarily need to be retrieved super fast. It just needs to be available for them. And I find in doing that, what's happening is, the growth requirements and space requirements are actually staying pretty flat inside of a lot of the infrastructure that we work in by just massaging what's going in there. It's not always just add. At some point in time, you got to come back around and decommission these things as well. So what better time than a migration project? So, John, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Dave. Those are all such great points. And there's just a few thoughts that I had to throw in there. On the first one, I just want to remind everyone that, it's kind of like when we were kids and our parents beat into our head to clean as you go. Clean as you go. So as you're making those new deployments and you see things that aren't used or can be consolidated or whatever, clean as you go. Deploy, decommission them, remove them. When you're in Active Directory and you see objects that are, no longer used, they've been disabled for 2 years or whatever, clean as you go. Get them out there. Because taking that and moving it forward, as I'll get into in a minute to your last point that you made there, is so valuable. And, the analogy I like to use here is if I'm working out in the garage with my kid, and he's pulling out every tool there is. And over the course of a weekend, I can't even walk in there, let alone find the tool I want without a 2-hour search, because he's had everything out and, who knows where it is or whatever. Whereas if he cleans as he goes and, wipes it off and puts it back and that kind of thing, I'm not left with this disorganized mess. It's the same way with our hyperconverged deployments. As you're building these HCI clusters and you have these nodes, take a serious look at where you can consolidate, where you can decommission, where you can clean as you go. The final point I said I'd get to, and it's to your last point about things out there, and I want to again spin this and look at cybersecurity, because this is top of mind for everybody in 2022. Is that you as the IT pro, you are responsible, we are responsible and accountable for everything that's running on the network. So if we have a system out there where we might have been able to migrate the storage to Azure NetApp files, like you mentioned, or even blob storage, that sort of thing, and we choose to run it internally on an on-prem file server, we now have responsibility and accountability for keeping that server completely patched against all threats. Going back to cyber insurance, a lot of them are putting requirements that, if there's a patch with security-related content, for your policy to be in effect, it has to be on your system within 30 days of release. Now, if you forget to do it, the insurance company will be smiling from ear to ear, and they won't be there to have a conversation with you and to listen to your reasons and mitigating factors and significant variations. They won't do any of that. They'll just go, oh, well, you had a server that created a vulnerability condition, which clearly we don't cover, and that kind of thing. Whereas if you do exactly what you said, Dave, and you look at those things and go, you know what, I don't need this on-prem anymore. I can move this up into the cloud, or I can consolidate it with another on-prem server or whatever, and you slice that down. It's one less thing for you to have to worry about. It's one less thing for you to, end up being held accountable for because you were overwhelmed by this server sprawl that you had out there, and so hopefully those add a little bit of value to our listeners today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to remind our listeners out there that we do have the opportunity to take some live Q&A. So there is a Q&A panel inside of your view for this session today. So if you have any questions, fire away, and we will try to get to as many as possible. All right, so the next one here, John, right into that whole, cyber insurance and cyber recovery piece. This is backup and recovery. And so there's some really big points that I have in here for, my 5 years plus working with hyperconverged infrastructure over a variety of vendors and platforms. Is number one is, we have to plan for the day that a cyber attack comes, because if you're lucky enough to be one of those organizations that hasn't had to deal with ransom or hasn't had to deal with a cyber attack, you need to plan that. You need to build that into your playbook, have a second DR ops guide for that, for a cyber attack, because recovering from a cyber attack, as you and I know, John, is totally different than some type of natural disaster. A couple of the other pieces here, and then I'll hand this over to you, John, for your thoughts, is that your backups are only as good as validation of those backups. Just because you have a backup file and you have a backup chain of incrementals and fulls and things like that, they're no good to you if the day that you need them, they don't work. So envision your entire HCI cluster infrastructure being down, and your last line of defense is some type of a backup. I really hope that somebody has actually tested those backups to make sure that they work, because if there's any type of corruption inside of that backup chain, now what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Are you at the next line of backups? Like, are you at the off-site backups? Are you going to tape medium, offline USB, immutable storage? Where are you going from this point in time? And this also raises another very, very valid point that, remember, all infrastructure has got moving parts inside of it. And so there's many different moving parts that combine the build of a data center, from the power that feeds the data center. Have you tested your generators? Have you tested your PDUs? Have you tried to, hot power off nodes? Like, who does that once it's in production? We don't normally go through that level of hardware failure until it actually happens. And so those failures can happen and they can cause outages. And so you need to make sure that you're prepared for that. So having backups and replicas of that infrastructure is so important. And if you're new to HCI and you're just about to implement HCI for the first time as one of our listeners, please understand that there is a big difference of traditional 3-tier infrastructure compared to a consolidated, rationalized, hyper-converged infrastructure. Whereas we used to just have compute nodes that we could, reboot at will, and we were connecting to some type of SAN storage, it's all consolidated into the same platform. We have to be careful how many nodes we reboot at a time. We've actually got a bit of an orchestration process. There's onboarding and training time that come in behind this. And so with that, John, I'll kind of hand it over to your thoughts on a little bit of backup and recovery here.
Thanks, Dave. I really want to emphasize what you said and drive it home about validation. And so the mnemonic device that I like to use and throw out there is 2 is 1, 1 is none. So if you have a backup and a test restore that you've done of that backup, then you have a backup. So those 2 pieces together equal a backup. If you've only taken the backup, you don't have a backup. So 2 is 1, 1 is none, right? And then the other way that I like people to think about this, the analogy I give is, I know we have listeners from different parts of the world. So I think about international mariners. So, the people that are out on the ships traversing our oceans, part of that supply chain that we talked about, moving goods and services. Well, they have, these things that are called the international rules of the road on the water, so to speak, that govern how to keep them safe and other boats safe and other vessels safe, that sort of thing. Well, one core principle of those rules, and these are laws, is that if you have any doubt about something, you must assume the worst. So if you have any doubt that another ship heard you, you have to assume they didn't. If you have any doubt about whether, someone saw you, you have to assume they didn't. So the reason I use that analogy is because if you have any doubt about your backup, about your DR, any doubt whatsoever, you need to assume it's not good. It's not going to be there when you need it. And if you haven't tested it, if you haven't validated it, you certainly should have doubt. So putting those 2 things together, I just really wanted to spend some time and emphasize that right now, particularly in the era that you mentioned, where we have to deal with very unique DR situations caused by cybersecurity events, and in fact, those tend to be more common in 2021, at least, that we were dealing with, than other type of DR events. You have to have a really robust and strong DR process in place, and that goes beyond just the equipment, just the software. It gets into the procedures, and so if you're not testing your restores on a regular basis, please implement that sooner rather than later.
Okay, John, we've got a great question that's come in from Jack here, and it's very relative to what we're talking about here. And it's, how do you ensure that ransomware does not encrypt your all of the backups as well? And so, do you have some advice for John on that, or for Jack on that?
Well, Dave, I'm gonna send it to you because it's I'm pretty sure that we both immediately thought of the same thing, and that's the word immutability. We need those immutable backups, and so I'll just with that said, I'll throw it back to you because I know you've got some great technical tips that you can quickly give Jack.
Yeah, for sure. So immutable to me is an interesting concept because I go all the way back to tape backup days, and some of you may still be using tape backups in your infrastructure. But the tapes that I remember for this, or you even go back to the days of floppy disks. Whoa, I'm really dating myself now, John. is there used to be a little clip at the top of a floppy disk that you could write protect that disk. And so immutable to me is no different than write protecting those backups that you have, and where you basically flip that little switch, or you cover the edge of your 5¼ inch floppy disk or your tape backup. It's no different for immutable style backups on storage appliances. We're going to make those backups write protected, so that for 1 to 2 weeks you cannot overwrite them. And so that is the real key. The second key to this is, along with immutability, is ensuring that your backup environment is not inside of the production domain. Because in the event that you have a domain administrator compromise and you're not following the principles of zero trust, that means the threat actors have access to pretty much everything right now. And so having a separate fabric where you've got different username, password, credentials, domain, we can move all of the backup infrastructure over there. So now even if the primary infrastructure got compromised, all my backup infrastructure is protected. It's almost a separate security boundary for all intents and purposes that we're creating. And that's so important for us as we go through and we look at that. So Jack, that's a great question. Thank you very much for that.
Dave, let me just throw a little extra out there for Jack. Another idea, when we talk about immutability and you talk about the tapes and that sort of thing, and people ask us, right, they say, well, so should I go back to taking them to the bank or whatever? There's more than one way to air gap your backup, particularly when you're talking about ransomware and cybersecurity. One of the strategies that I love to use is I put a backup target on a network port that then that port only enables at the backup time and then automatically disables. So it effectively automates air gapping that backup target for periods of time. And it's just a technique that we take in addition to what you laid out to keep those backups unchanging or immutable. Thanks, Dave.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit more about networking here. And, I'm a big Microsoft fan. I work in the Microsoft space for the last 25 years. So one of the big configurations that you have with Microsoft Hyperconvergence is remote direct memory access. And what does that mean? That means offloading on your network adapters. I want to take in when storage jobs are replicating my mirrored data across nodes. I don't want the hosts to take the CPU hit on that. So we can offload. It's an offloading technology. And there's still a huge argument out in the industry today around the two different core technologies around passing RDMA traffic across the network. And one is easier to configure. Second one takes a little bit more work because you have to configure some switches and some policy. And so, I find the vendors really push iWarp technology as just, plug and play. Doesn't matter what kind of switches you have, very simple, very minimal configuration. Problem is, I've seen a lot of clusters fall flat on their face where those iWarp configurations weren't working properly. If you want the robust, rock-solid configuration, RDMA over converged Ethernet V2 is still the standard that we lead with. We build every single one of our clusters with this. And yes, it requires some tuning, it requires some setup, but once you have that setup and tuning down, you can replicate that now over in a scripted fashion through all of your deployments, and we just don't have problems. And I like to go to sleep at night, John. I don't like to be kept up at night with infrastructure-related issues. And the next piece around networking is, we're in 2022. Maybe it's time to start thinking about, a network upgrade project. And I've listed a couple different iterations inside of here. I put a small B on 100 gig. It's supposed to be a big B or whatever. 10, 25, 100 gig network plus. Is that viable now? And the short answer is yes. The price points on those back-end switches have come down a lot. I like those fast switches. Faster we can make those storage jobs run across the east-west traffic, the better performant they're going to be. And in an interesting design, we've started to build 3-node switchless clusters on 100 gig backplane for the storage networks, which is actually a pretty cool design because now I don't need to make the investment in the switches to take advantage of the faster back-end networks. And so the other thing is when we're looking at slower networks, sometimes we have to look at tuning some of those storage jobs so that we don't flatten things. All right. Next up, this is a big one for me. is stress testing, stress testing, stress testing. You only really get one kick at the cat with this. And so this one here is at the very beginning of your project. So if you're looking at hyperconvergence in 2022 and you're going to be bringing in a new cluster, the way that we do this in the Microsoft world is they've actually introduced a rational stress testing tool for us that we've used for years called VM Fleet. VM Fleet builds virtual machines and uses a utility called disk speed to synthesize input-output operations into our hyperconverged infrastructure. And the big deal for me with this is that we can standardize those testing. So if we want to see how well a traditional solid-state drive performs versus an NVMe drive versus, a persistent memory or PMEM, we can actually now test that. We can see how this is going to perform so that we know how well this is going to scale as we move out over the growth of our 60-month project, 5-year project. The big update here that I have for you here today is that VM Fleet version 2 is now out, just recently released by Microsoft. It's the biggest update in over 3 years that they've had to the testing tools, better and more ways to simulate. And the one thing that I recommend is that when you're working with your vendors, one of the things that I always suggest is that have them run VM Fleet when they're building the cluster in the factory. And you can compare that to what your numbers look like when you pin this up in your infrastructure, because there's a significant delta between the numbers that the vendor is seeing compared to what you're seeing. You know that you have an infrastructure-related problem, and you can fix that before you migrate a bunch of workloads over to that. So that's kind of a big one there. All right, the next one here, cloud integration, John. And this one here, I'm going to lean on you a little bit for this one here, is integrating our hyper-converged infrastructure from, a cloud perspective and having that unified view, that unified approach. We'll call it the utopia of a single pane of glass. I know that you've done a lot of work with, things like virtual VDI in the cloud with Azure Virtual Desktops, but that ability to take and provision from the cloud, that ability to take and set up role-based access control via the cloud, via privileged identity management. How important do you see that in 2022 for hyper-converged configurations today? Like just having that seamless approach of hyper-convergence that we would see on-prem and have the same view in the cloud. How important is that to our listeners out there today?
Well, I liken it like to whenever you go to a big building in a large city, or for everyone, you've probably seen a movie with this where there's part of security that sits in a room or sits behind a desk and has a monitor with a bunch of different views of a bunch of different cameras. That person is looking at the big picture so that they can direct resources where they need and that kind of thing efficiently and effectively. It isn't that, sending people out on search parties and that kind of thing wouldn't eventually find a problem. It's, would it do it in a timely enough fashion to be successful? Would it be efficient, or would it cost a lot more money? And the obvious answer is, it certainly wouldn't be efficient. It would cost more money. It may not be timely enough or effective. And it's kind of the same way when it comes to this management of our hybrid deployments. And, we have single pane of glass tools. There's a lot of great integrations with things like Admin Center now. And as you mentioned, being able to do just-in-time delegation, privileged identity management from up in our cloud environments, that kind of thing. But another way that I like to present this to others is a lot of IT pros in the Microsoft stack that work in the Microsoft stack, rely on PowerShell. PowerShell is the key management tool for everything from Active Directory to file servers to, networks. And so they've gotten used to that and they've done that. Well, one nice thing is with the integration of the cloud commandlets for Azure, you got the EXO v2 module. If you want to do Exchange Online, you got all these different commandlet modules. You can create scripts or your own modules that allow you to have a centralized single interface for doing administrative tasks. Whether that task is being completed on-prem or in the cloud is irrelevant. So now you're sitting behind that command center with access to whichever part of the system you need, and not have to take special action to get it, right? You don't have to remember certain different commands because they can be part of that scripted environment and different things. And so I think that is easing for everyone. And, Dave, you and I have talked about this a lot with a number of people at the sessions we've given, whether live or virtual, and that's the concept of hybrid. And, both of us agree that hybrid is going to be the common scenario for the years to come. There are just some things that have to be on premise. And there are too many advantages to not have something in the cloud. So hybrid is going to be the rule of the road for the foreseeable future. So being able to manage in that unified form is just so critical.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And we had a great question that came in, and it's just a clarification point from Sophia. Sophia was asking about the names of the stress testing tools that we use for our Microsoft HCI infrastructure, and it's called VM Fleet. If you just do a Google search for VM Fleet, you'll find it'll pop up for you, and you'll be able to get a whole bunch more information on that. But thank you very much, Sophia. Great question. All right, the next one here. We do a lot of work, John, with all-flash configurations, and we've been a fan of all-flash configurations for a long time ago. So the question that you always think about with different disk designs and things like that is, are spinning disks dead? Are we, like, the spinning disks in the data center still have a place? And if I had my choice, I would say that, yeah, spinning disks are dead. And the reason that I say that, John, is what I find is the mean time between failure for flash devices compared to spinning disks is so much greater. We've seen so much fewer drive failures, like physical drive failures on flash storage versus spinning disk over the years. And I go back. I take my 25-year history of drives. So I'm a little jaded on this, John, because some of the older drives that we had that were running on SCSI platform and stuff like that, when they would fail hard, you could almost hear them crash in the data center as the platters were coming into one another. So let's take all of that piece of it aside, the really old drives. We're just seeing less and less, and most of the things that we're quoting out for customers and we're talking to them about it's some type of flash design. And one of the concerns that I know that a lot of our customers and the viewers at our sessions that we give think about is that, okay, well, just the raw space is just not there. And that's actually not true, because you can now get SSD sizing options into 16 terabyte plus drives. Yeah, there's a price to pay for it, but you're not limited to 4 terabyte drives anymore. So you can get the capacity you want in all flash. It is possible. And from my perspective, the real place for spinning disks right now is if you need a large amount of storage, because there's just no way to get that price point down. You just have to understand that you're going to be managing that storage a little bit more. Like, you're going to have to be going and replacing disks and doing those things that we've kind of forgotten that we have to do, because we really don't have to replace a lot of those drives in an all-flash configuration. And I see those as optimal for like backup targets or DR configurations, but primary production workloads, I'm seeing primarily all flash right now. What are you seeing from out in the field there, John?
I'm in step with you 100%, Dave. And I look at it, and I'm always trying to think of ways to do a couple things for our IT pro friends and family that are out there, and two at the top include reliability and efficiency. Because, IT pros, things are just getting added to their plate without a whole lot of reduction. When we all went remote work, a whole bunch extra work came at us to make that happen in our organizations and everything else. But most organizations didn't run out and add a bunch of manpower. or woman power or, any kind of power to back it up. They just expected us to get it done. Same thing's happening with cybersecurity and that kind of thing. So anytime we can take something, a burden off of an IT pro, I consider that a huge win. And one of the ways that I feel we do that is by eliminating spinning disk. It's like you said, it just has so much higher a risk of failure that, it's tangible. And the other is efficiency. Because you don't have to do the maintenance cycles that you mentioned that we used to have to do and we still have to do when we have large quantities of spinning disk out there, because it's running faster, it's performing faster, those kind of things, it is inherently more efficient for us to have it in our environments. We just don't have as much work to do on that. That allows us to focus on those other things that are being added. Like you mentioned, price point is price point. So if you have huge amounts and the economics just don't work out to get all flash, then it's going back to something you said earlier, which is a great piece of advice. Is spend some time and effort on that design, on that plan, and then follow your plan. So design it so that you can take the most advantage of flash storage, and then use spinning disk where you have to backfill to meet the economic demand. That's my best advice, right? So any dollars you can spend on storage, spend it on the flash. But if you have to buy spinning disk, it's not the end of the world.
So we had a great question that just came in from Sirius. Hopefully I said that right. Has the life expectancy of flash drives improved through the years? I've read that although we have reliability and efficiency, their life is short and the upgrades are needed from time to time. So I can speak to this one, John, because one of the things that we look at is we look at a 5-year life cycle for production for most things, and that's typically the warranty cycle that you have. So if you're following that 5-year life cycle, you'd be pretty hard challenged to be pushing these newer drives. And if you do have that big of concern, there is different types of flash storage that you can purchase. The cheaper end flash storage is going to have less writes, definitely, than the higher end. You pay a premium for it as you take and as you go through. So if that is a huge concern, you can do that. But in all honesty, we've used NVMe storage, and we typically don't put FLC drives and things like that, which are the higher write capacity drives, in for customers. We're just using either the lower end ones and stuff like that, and we're getting what it is that we need out of it. So yeah, I haven't seen a huge concern from that perspective. There are limitations on those writes, but it's not years. That flash storage could stay there for 100 years. If you didn't write to it, it's still going to perform for you, right? So I look at the fact that how hard are you actually pushing that, and that's where the testing at the beginning of your project really comes in as well. We have another question that just came in, John. We'll take this and we'll move on after that. This one's from Jack again. Is multi-cloud and hybrid support available? And I'll rephrase that question just a little bit. It's not that it's available. How important is it? So it's just back to the previous slide that you had, John. And I would say that, Jack, that question there is one that you should definitely look at with any hyperconverged solution that you have. It should have some type of integration from a hybrid perspective with whatever cloud it is that you're using, for sure. All right, this one here, we've got a couple more, and then we'll get into a few more questions here, John. Battery backups and UPSs over COVID and your HCI infrastructure. Do you want to speak to this one? Because I know that this is a little intangible that's come back to bite a few of our customers with UPS batteries failing because nobody's been in the data centers for the last couple of years.
Oh man, Jay, thanks for that throwing it over, because I have so many thoughts on that. This comes to that kind of point I made earlier about the responsibility and the accountability. Even though many of us have very good reasons for why they haven't been touched, it doesn't matter when that UPS fails and an HCR cluster hard crashes and production is impacted and different things. they can't hear us. We're like that teacher from the old Charlie Brown cartoons, for anybody that's seen those, where all you hear is wah, 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 wah. As soon as that event happens and we try and explain to management or explain to leadership, why we couldn't check that UPS or do that kind of thing, they don't hear it. They just hear wah, 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 wah. And so my recommendation and the thing that I tell everybody to do immediately is on those core workloads, those workloads that are going to cause you to take an outage if they don't stay running, those UPSs, those uninterruptible power sources, I'm not going to say supply because I really want to be more general, they should have network connectivity that you are monitoring. So not just, hey, I'm going to configure some alerts, and then if I see it, I'll do whatever, that you're actually connecting to, you're looking at some reports, you're looking to see how often is this thing having to flip back and forth, what's the quality of the incoming power, that kind of thing. Get that network management card in place, get it configured, and monitor it, because it puts you in a position to know, hey, I've got something failing that isn't going to cover me in the event of an outage. Let me get in front of this, right? One of the things I'm really concerned with, Dave, is since COVID has happened and kept us out of the data center and things like that, when we get back to it, people will catch that low-hanging fruit, the stuff that's right in front of their face. But how many UPSs are going to get forgotten about in a switch cabinet, that may run a core part of the distribution center or something until there's a crash? I really worry about them being forgotten and overlooked until, our IT pro friends and family are faced with an outage.
Yeah, and that's just a new one that COVID's introduced. That's why I wanted to throw that one in there. Okay, we've got time for one more here, is investing in threat protection. So just because you've got your hyperconverged infrastructure in place, it doesn't necessarily mean that all your VMs and your workloads are automatically protected. And so investing in your cyber defense is pretty huge. And this is just kind of a little bit of a shameless plug for you and me, John, because we have actually technically written the book on this. We've got a new book that's out, Cybersecurity Defense with Microsoft Defender, all things about Microsoft Defender for your data center, including Defender Cloud. And this will actually work on any platform that you've got. It doesn't matter who your vendor is. We need to make sure that all of those workloads, including the core hypervisors, are protected. And Microsoft's done a great job with this. The threat protection that you'd see with advanced threat protection that you'd see on Windows 10 desktops is actually available on servers as well. So if you weren't aware of that, it is available, and it can be priced on a SKU basis per server. In order to take and to gain access to it, it's actually really easy. You just need one M365 V5 license, and it'll activate your securitycenter.microsoft.com portal for you. And that'll add the ability for you to onboard devices, and you can just work with your vendor of choice. And if you want a lab guide for walking through how to set that up, well, now you have access to ones available up on Amazon. And so with that, we've got about 5 minutes left here. I think we're going to have a chance to do maybe one more question here. Let's see. We'll do one more question here, and then we'll take a quick break here, John. And this question is from Jorge. And the question is the data scanned for threats before or in real time as the data being backed up, and also before it's restored to the customer? So should we scan that data in line? Should we scan it before, after? And I think the answer to that is all of the above. And with advanced threat protection, it's inline protection for you. It's not something that's post-process. It's something that's going to protect you real time. And one of the big pieces of this is not just throwing your antivirus on there, not just configuring a threat management portal, it's learning about it as well. And so Microsoft also has a full certification around this platform called the Microsoft Security Operation Analyst. It's new training out there that's available. And we, like both John O'Neill Sr. and myself, highly recommend that individuals and organizations invest in that. But, with the Microsoft Threat Protection Solution for HCI investments, It's not only going to give you that inline protection, it's going to give you endpoint detection and response. It's going to give you threat hunting capability. You can integrate that with your SIEM infrastructure as well for log analytics, and throw a bit of cloud AI behind it so that you can really, truly be protected. I can't tell you how many times this platform has saved our bacon, John O'Neill Sr. and myself, and it's something that we really feel that you can't go without. And it's actually becoming a requirement of cyber insurance. So, John, we've got about 1 minute. I'll give you closing thoughts kind of for 1 minute here, and then we'll wrap up and take a break.
Well, Dave, all I'm really going to do is kind of reemphasize some of the high points we made. Clean as you go. Keep those things decommissioned and optimized as you're deploying new things. Get rid of old things. 2 is 1, 1 is none. Make sure that you're validating your backups on your DR system, because if you're not, you really don't have a backup you can trust. When it comes to security, keep those backups immutable. And so I'll kind of leave everybody with those 3 highlights.
Perfect. And with that, we'll hand it back over to our other friend, John Waters. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was awesome. We are going to take a short break now, but Dave and John will be back for our second session, Real-World HCI Best Practices. That session will be moderated by my colleague, David Rammel, the editorial driving force behind Virtualization and Cloud Review. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor, Nutanix. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away an iPhone 13. That's the one with the 256 gigabytes of storage. But you must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thanks to our sponsor, Nutanix, for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Real World HCI Best Practices. I'd like to welcome back from the first session Dave Kawula and John O'Neill Sr. It looks like we got basically the same audience as the first session, so I'll skip reading their bios, which you can see in the console. Suffice it to say that they've been doing this stuff for a long time, and they know what they're talking about. Guys, it's great to have you back. Always informative and entertaining. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, David. Pleased to be back for the second session here. When we have the opportunity to present this session, Real-World HCI Best Practices, I know John O'Neill Sr. and myself, we were really excited about this one because we are individuals that are in operational support with hyperconverged infrastructure on a daily basis. This is our day job where we take and we help customers with their hyperconverged infrastructure. So this is a chance for us to relay a little bit of our notes from the field over the course of the next hour. So very pleased to have you. A little bit of housekeeping for the session here. I know John, myself, we love to have the sessions interactive. So if you have any burning questions about hyperconverged infrastructure, best practices, real-world designs, anything like that, you do have a questions and answers section inside of your portal, and you feel free to ask any of those questions. All right, let's get started here. So, John, this question I'll lead off with you is that operationalization is a very interesting component of any IT technology, and hyperconverged infrastructure is no different. Do your traditional operational support policies, procedures that you have built for traditional infrastructure supporting virtualizations play true for HCI? Or do you have to, what we'll call, quote unquote, rewrite the book a little bit about the way we think about managing infrastructure when hyperconvergence is in play?
Well, Dave, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to this one and lead us off here. And the short answer is no, they don't. And the way that I like to explain this is that when we're deploying HCI in our environments, we're retooling our environment. we're retooling our data center. So think of that and realize that if you're retooling the data center, you need to retool your operations guy. You need to retool your knowledge set. And so it doesn't mean you have to throw the book out and start from scratch. There's a lot in there that still applies. But you need to go through it and update it, because when it comes down to it, we get a lot of questions, you and I, about the longevity and the return on investment over time and all these kind of things about HCI. When it comes down to it, a lot of that is based upon the accuracy and efficiency of the day-to-day routine operational tasks. What each of us as IT pros are doing on a day in and day out basis to care and feed those HCI clusters, those HCI nodes, the switches that may be involved in our east-west or north-south traffic, all those things put together. If we care and feed them properly, those HCI nodes, you and I know this, we do it on a daily basis, and the units that we build together, we go in and we have only a singular basis upon which we judge them. We build them to last beyond the warranty period of the hardware. So we don't configure them in a way that's only going to last a year or two. We want these things to last 5 years or more, and so we configure them that way. But they'll only stay that way if operations really does a good job care and feeding them, and operations can only do that if they write the playbook specific to the HCI systems that we're deploying. That's my thoughts on that.
For sure, and one of the things that I think the vendors have done a very good job, John, is automating the orchestration process for either adding, expanding, patching nodes, because there are a lot of moving parts behind the scenes. And I'll take the example of a manual patch process, not using automation, in a 4-node cluster with all of the steps that are required. If you had to completely map those out, and you had let's just take the example of 3-tiered infrastructure. If it was traditional infrastructure and I had a 4-node cluster and all those nodes were connecting to a SAN, the process would be actually fairly simple and routine. First, I would have to live migrate or vMotion those workloads off of the existing compute host. And then once that was done, I can basically patch at will. I can reboot, so I can do what I need to do, put it in maintenance mode. There's not much else that goes on. When we collapse that infrastructure and we bring the storage into the mix with hyperconvergence, now every time I reboot those nodes, I have to be aware of the back-end storage jobs. I have to be aware of the health of the virtual disks. I have to be aware of the health of the physical disks. And so what used to be maybe 10 steps per node is now 30-plus steps per node that happen during the patching process. And so the big key to this is finding ways to automate and orchestrate that process. So things like CAL, which is the acronym that lists under, stands for Cluster Aware Updating. So that process from Microsoft, for example, automates those dependencies underneath the covers. You still want the manual process to know what it is, but you can automate that. Windows Admin Center can automate that process. Virtual Machine Manager can automate that process. Other third-party management tools can automate those processes for you. But when hyperconvergence comes into play, it is a different support look and feel for our infrastructure techs that are out there looking after this. It's not the same as what they had. And yes, they will need to be retrained, and you will need to re-operationalize that staff on it. So that's kind of the first one. Oh, this one here, John. Oh boy, am I passionate about this. Deduplication. Oh man. Deduplication is probably one of the biggest pains from an operational support perspective that I deal with. And the reason for it is that in the case of Microsoft, they make it so easy to turn on deduplication. It is like one checkbox inside of Windows Admin Center to turn on deduplication on your HCI cluster. What's not mentioned in the fine print there is that that's post-process deduplication. That is going to be something that you are going to take a hit on. It is something that you can see a significant slowdown potentially on SQL Server or Exchange workloads. And it is the source of over 98% of my Microsoft-related HCI tickets. And I will just stop there for a minute, and I will repeat what I just said. My personal experience in dealing with Microsoft HCI, 98% of my issues that I have that come back from customers are deduplication related. And so the problem is that when sizing the clusters, John, customers looked at the value of storage that they would get with deduplication, and they didn't necessarily purchase enough space, and they're trying to just really squeeze as much out of that infrastructure as they can, and everything runs fine for the first 12 months. And it's on month 13 heading up to month 60 that we really run into problems. And so my biggest piece of advice, real world, note from the field, is being very, very careful with that deduplication button. Deduplication is not meant for everything. Deduplication is certainly not meant for high transaction rate of change VMs like SQL or Exchange. It is fine if you're going to have like a flat file server, maybe some VDI instances, but be very, very careful on turning that on in production. We still do use deduplication for like backup targets, but once again, that's a lot more static data. And so, John, what are your thoughts on dedupe? What have you seen from the field with dedupe?
I've seen my best friend Dave lose sleep and risk putting his hair into a condition that I have. And for those that can't see me, because as Dave says, I got a great face for radio. I am bald, so I've watched you, Dave, fight with dedupe where people have turned it on without thinking about it, and then they've over provisioned it, and they've crashed their clusters, and then can't get them back up, and production's down, and distribution's down, and all these things, all because they just think storage is endless when they involve that word dedupe. So if you want to save your friends and coworkers' hairline, if you want to keep them from becoming a grumbly old person, avoid dedupe. That's my recommendation. Like you said, there are unique use cases for it, particularly when it comes to DR or things like that. I mean, with DR, we tend to have multiple targets, so a loss of one of them wouldn't lose the DR system. That's why I say that it fits there. But for your production workloads, my straight out recommendation is avoid dedupe on those. Buy the storage you need.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And one of the other ones that I didn't list in here as well is along those lines and making sure that you're managing your storage properly is I really advise staying away from dynamically expanding virtual hard disks. Make sure you're using fixed size hard disks. And it's not for the point that the dynamically expanding disks don't perform. It's I find that we run into an over-provisioning situation where we actually run ourselves out of storage because the IT teams will see and the business users that are using the virtual machines and workloads will see the additional space and be like, oh, I copying that additional 500 gigs SQL Server database, no problem. Copying these additional files here, they're just temporary, it's no big deal. Problem is, once that hard drive balloons up, it doesn't automatically shrink down, and the only way to take and fix that is an online outage, and you don't want to be in that situation. So if it's production, fix the size of your virtual disks. John, the moderators here were just asking me if you could just please mute your line when not speaking. We're just getting a little bit of feedback, okay? All right. This next one's pretty funny for me. Do not run HCI in your production domain. I'm like, well, what did you just say? And like, isn't this whole summit about using hyperconverged infrastructure? Where are these guys going with this? And yeah, I did say that. Don't run HCI, hyperconverged infrastructure, in your production domain. And the reason for that is I've seen so many customers, when the ransomware attack hits and they have an admin level compromise, that HCI infrastructure is fair game inside of there, and the bad guys will go ahead and they will encrypt those host servers that you've got, and you're going to be in a very, very bad situation. So what we recommend doing is moving your HCI from production into a dedicated fabric. And now the question's going to come up, well, what is a fabric? I've never even heard of a fabric before. What is this? Simply put, a fabric in its most simplistic form can be a separate administrative boundary for you. And so in the speak of Active Directory, this could be a separate Active Directory forest and a separate Active Directory domain, and most importantly, a separate set of credentials, because a lot of organizations are struggling right now trying to button up their security posture that they have right now. And it just, honestly, it just takes time. You're not going to snap your fingers and overnight move to a zero trust model, going to fixing all of the problems that you've had for 20 plus years of managing and maintaining Active Directory and kind of loose security practices aren't going to fix themselves overnight. So one of the fastest ways to do this is moving some of the infrastructure that we have today from the flat domain structure that we have over to a separate domain that we can now lock down, harden, separate set of credentials, throw multi-factor at it, throw advanced threat protection at it. And that is probably one of the biggest things that will potentially save your bacon in the event of a cyber attack with your hyper-converged infrastructure. So, John, what are your thoughts on the fabric? How important in the world that we live in today and heading into 2022 here, if our viewers that are listening right now don't have a fabric built, how important do you think that this is to get this on the roadmap right now?
Well, second only to doing those things necessary to maintain that cyber insurance policy that you're going to need to rely on if you have an event or when you have an event, I put getting the fabric in place. It is that critical. You and I have designed the fabric and tweaked it over the years, and it has, saved our bacon more than once, because creating this secure environment in which the host, the basis upon which our entire production domain is built, protecting that in a highly secure, highly limited environment gives us access to quickly rebuild things, to analyze things, to get back in and get to work when disaster strikes. When everything is flat and it's singular, and you lose the host, you lose the DR systems, you lose the production systems, getting back up takes, anywhere from 3 to 8 times as long as when you have that fabric in place, based on our experiences. So it really is a worthwhile investment, and just make sure that you don't forget anything. Details matter. So once you have that secure environment, put all the things that need to be secure, those hosts, that DR, that sort of thing, in that fabric. If you forget something, then that thing you forgot is at risk. So I would put this as my number 2 priority, secondary only to doing the things necessary to maintain your cyber insurance coverage.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. All right, the next one is looking at the different types of volumes that we have and how we store data inside of our hyper-converged infrastructure. And so, over the years, we've seen a variety of different ways of taking and storing our data. Some would be more performance. Some would offer better protection. Some would offer, better protection and be more performant. And the big key to this one here, and I've seen this so often in regards to COVID-19. We spoke about this in the previous session about UPS power and making sure that, we've got the generators tested, we've got UPS tested. Storms will hit, forest fires will hit, power will go out, it could go out hard. How resilient are your volumes to power failures? And so this is one of the big things that, I'm not as concerned when I talk to customers about just raw space and things like that, and I have this argument a lot. It's just, approach that you have. Being that I work in this space a lot from a Microsoft perspective, optimizing that storage is one of the things I find that some of my customers really struggle with. They just want one big flat volume that's going to have 64 terabytes, and that's where they want to store everything, because they don't want to be in the storage business. And that's a really bad idea. And so the reason is it's not when it's working, it's when it's not. Because in the event that something goes down, there's rebuild and repair processes that have to go on behind the scenes. So having more smaller volumes is actually a better way to do things. Microsoft actually recommends that you match the number of volumes to the number of nodes that you have. So if you have 3 nodes, your increments would go in 3, 6, 9, 12, something like that. You want to match those. You want to pair them and potentially have some affinity on, to where you're running those that virtual infrastructure. For ourselves, we do a lot of work in, critical plant operations and things like that. And so the resiliency is of utmost importance over the performance. We still want performance, but resiliency is more important. So in a 2-node switchless cluster, for example, we actually run a combination of a 2-way mirror and the parity volume on top of that. So it's like running a 2-way mirror and then throwing RAID 5 on top of it. And it's called nested resiliency from a Microsoft speak perspective. And what that allows us to do is completely lose a node. And you ask yourself, where would you lose a whole node? Like, is that common where you lose a whole node? Yeah, it is. We lose a whole node every time we patch. Oh, we do. Because when we patch, I have to reboot that node. What happens if you lose a drive in the remaining node while you're patching the first node? Well, now you're into a situation where the whole cluster goes down. So thus the nested resilient volumes become so important, because when you're dealing with hyperconvergence, you deal with the situation of node down every time you reboot. And that's the thought process you have to get into. It's not, just when I pull the power. It's when I safely shut down that machine, I actually lose an entire node. And how many nodes can I lose? How fast can I do patching? How fast can I do offline maintenance? And these are all really important pieces to understand when we're working with hyperconverged infrastructure versus traditional 3-tier infrastructure, because my Microsoft administrators that are out there, the ones that we've traditionally trained to right-click on things throughout their entire career, we don't necessarily think of the world in storage like this, like we have to with hyperconvergence. And, it doesn't matter what platform you're on. There are many platforms that are out there today. They all, generally speaking, work the same way. If I'm doing maintenance and I reboot one of the nodes, I take every single one of those drives offline while it's in that kind of reboot state. And then when it comes back online, there's rebuild processes that have to go in. And so when we look at this from best practices and kind of real-world notes from the field, this is the hardest part that I have getting across to new administrators of hyperconverged infrastructure, is we really are the storage guy now. And every time you reboot or touch one of those nodes, it's like rebooting a node in your SAN. And I've got VMs running on top of it, so it does become more complicated. And so that's kind of a big one for that point. The next one we talked about in our previous session, and this one I'll pass back over to John here, is the importance of, once again, advanced persistent threat protection. And John, can you maybe speak to just the difference of a traditional antivirus platform, like maybe one that comes built in stock into Windows Server, like just Windows Defender that's just there, it's part of the OS, versus adding the advanced threat protection pieces? Like, what's the benefit for an organization to do that? Did I lose you, John? Are you still there?
I am still here, Dave. Sorry about that. I was muted to prevent that feedback, and I forgot to unmute. First world problems, right? You know me, I always like to find analogies, and the one that I come to here when I think about APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Protection, versus conventional antivirus or anti-malware solutions is the difference between proactive and reactive. And so here's the analogy that I'll give. Would you, whoever you are, rather stand there and let somebody kick you in the kneecap and then decide what to do? Or would you rather identify that they're about to kick you in the kneecap, move out of the way, not get kicked in the kneecap, and take it from there? And most people I know would choose not to get kicked in the kneecap. And that's the difference, right? With conventional solutions, in many cases, they react to the attack. Okay, so they're getting kicked in the knee and then taking some action. And even when it comes into things like just virus detection that could be heuristic or whatever, and everybody goes, "Oh, that's proactive," and it is, but it's not proactive in the sense of advanced persistent threat hunting. I mean, or advanced persistent threat protection. That uses things like threat hunting. That uses concepts like correlation, where it's taking data from so many different sources, not just a singular file action or, a mismatch, checksum, that kind of thing. It's looking at identity operations as well as network activity, as well as file activity, and it's putting all those things together into a story. And it's using that story to identify attacks before they even really happen, before they get a foothold. So it is giving you the capability to be proactive, to avoid getting kicked in the knee without requiring the 1,000 man hours it would take to do it. Because to do it manually, to do it without the technologies that are out there, it would just be impossible. You can't analyze 10,000 data points in a matter of seconds like systems, APT, the Microsoft Defender platforms in the cloud, that kind of thing can do.
Well, and let's take an example, a real world example, John, where Log4j just hit, and that was exploits against Apache servers that were out there, and what that actually looked like for our users that were out in the field. And with advanced persistent threat protection and threat hunting capabilities, now we can just run in a Microsoft world. It's just a Custo query inside of the interface, and we can now quickly go hunt to see which devices are potentially exposed, compromised, currently compromised, which ones we still have to clean up. And so to me, that's where it's so important, is that in the day that the threat actually hits, now we can go rationalize and we can gain access to that data, not just the front end. We want to be protected. It's that, okay, we might have some holes here. How do we immediately go close those down?
You know it, Dave.
All right, next up is, and this is just a little bit of an add-on from the previous session here, is, we always have to have a DR and recovery slide whenever we talk about best practices, because we want to make sure that we're protected in the event that we have any types of issues that are going to take and occur. Remember that hyperconverged infrastructure, in the most simplistic way that I can put this, is regular old servers. It's regular old servers that we've got from the vendor of your choice. They're going to have disks inside of them, spinning disks, solid-state disks, persistent memory, whatever it is, and they're going to have a networking component. And that's really what makes up a hyperconverged node. And there is a potential that those could fail. You could drop a CPU. You could have a ransomware attack. You could have a variety of things that cause those workloads to potentially go offline. So one of the things that doesn't change from your infrastructure is, in your DR and operations plan, is you need to make sure that you've got availability. So are you replicating that infrastructure somewhere else in the event that that's going to go down? Maybe that entire site goes down. We have to have site resiliency. You've got to determine that for your business and see how you're going to protect against that. The biggest piece heading into 2022 that I want organizations to look at, John, is I want organizations to figure out how they can create immutable protected backups. Because what the threat actors actually do now is they look for servers with the word backup on them, because a lot of backup software that's out there I'll use Veeam as an example. I do a lot of work with my friends over at Veeam. And when you install that platform to protect your infrastructure, it actually creates a folder on your backup target called backup in whatever that folder is. So now the bad guys, what they're doing, and I actually had the chance doing some ransomware recovery this summer, was the cyber insurance vendor provided us with the INI file that the Rebel ransomware strain was using, and it actually looks for backup tools that are running on servers. So it looks to see if, those services for your backup tools are running. It looks to see if the word backup is there. And if the word backup in a folder structure is there, there's a string in there that says auto delete. So it's just going to basically shift delete all your backups as soon as it finds them. Okay. So little tip for you. If you're storing backups on a file server or infrastructure server somewhere, maybe avoid storing it in something with the word backup. Maybe have a code word or something in there, because the bad guys are looking at the low-hanging fruit, and if they can just immediately quickly nuke all your backups, now they've got a way to take and cause and inflict a lot of pain on you right away. And so remember, the threat actors are very smart. They're in most cases ahead of where we are from a technology perspective. And the other thing is with your DR and recovery, please move that off to the separated fabric, like what we were talking about. Please move that out of the primary domain, because we've seen too many admin level attacks compromise organizations. Okay, the next one here, John, this one here is going to be one for you. You're my dear friend in security that knows all things security. Out-of-box configurations and next finishing Windows desktops or Windows servers is not a good idea. So in 2022, if you haven't done this already, you need to be looking at security baselines. And so, John, can you maybe speak to why an organization would want to look at security baselines, and why those are so important to really remove all of that low-hanging fruit and to become compliant?
Absolutely, Dave. So, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Or for the Harry Potter fans out there, you may remember the quote that we have to decide between what is easy and what is right. And Microsoft has done a great job. Most vendors have in making the next finish approach really easy. The problem is that they compromise some of the security decisions that you would normally make to make it easy, right? Security is almost, as part of its definition, neither easy nor convenient. So when we do these out-of-box configurations or these next finish, that sort of thing, we fall into this misbelief that, hey, Microsoft created it this way, so I'm sure that it's secure. Well, not really. They just made some decisions to make it easy for you to get it up and running. Now you need to optimize that. And Microsoft themselves, to use them in the example, they have a ton of great security baselines available for different products and all that. But, my recommendation, and I know, you've recommended the same thing, is take advantage of those resources that are available to you from other organizations, whether they be organizations like CIS or organizations like NIST. But, go out there, and these organizations have, they keep their fingers on the pulse kind of thing, and they are constantly updating what is the best way to mitigate certain risks and attacks, and they're putting that together. And in many cases, they create configuration scripts and all sorts of different things that you can rely on to get this advanced configuration in place without having to tediously do it one by one or even have knowledge of it. Now, with that said, this is a case where, test twice, deploy once kind of thing. So, security configurations can drastically impact your operations, and it isn't what you know that will get you in trouble, it's what you don't know, obviously. So if you miss some small little detail about that configuration, it could shut down your users from being able to do certain things and that sort. So my recommendation is test it some more, and then deploy it.
Okay, John, we've got a great question that came in that we can discuss here for a couple minutes from Cirrus. So APTs are basically sponsored by nations or very large organizations, and it's usually at large scale. The solution to that is building stronger perimeter defenses. Is it this converged network architecture in HCI that gives it a competitive advantage against these APTs or state-sponsored attacks? And so I'll start off, and then I'll pass this over to John. So realistically, protecting yourself against state-sponsored attacks, number one is you need advanced threat protection in there, number one. So you need to make sure you're running that inside of your hyperconverged infrastructure, hosts, guests, everything. You need to be protected. Number two is you also need to make sure that you're following the principles of least privilege and zero trust. That's what's going to give you the advantage, and that's regardless of what the platform is. HCI, three-tier infrastructure doesn't matter. And the most important piece that John and I have found is moving that infrastructure out to a dedicated fabric, because the problem that we run into is that throwing these security templates into a production environment takes time. You need to test that. You need to review it. You need to work with the application owners. Whereas if I build a fresh greenfield environment, I can kind of lock it down out of box, and so I can protect it, and I have a much easier way of getting to the finish line. And so with that, John, I'll pass that back to you.
Well, Dave, you were so spot on that all I'm really going to do is use a bunch of words to add an exclamation point to everything you said, because those were three great, perfect tips to answer that question.
Awesome. Okay. So the next one is in regards to security, same lines is vulnerability assessments, John. Running monthly, weekly, yearly vulnerability assessments as part of your IT audit, or doing real-time vulnerability assessments. Why do we need to move to a more real-time model for vulnerability assessments on your HCI infrastructure and the workloads that run on it versus a periodic approach?
So do you want to start this one off and then I'll go, or would you like me to throw out there?
No, you go ahead, because the next batch are basically kind of some pointed questions that we got through the presentation here. So you go ahead and take this one. I'll take the next.
Great. And so what I really want to focus in on here is that in 2022 and of course previously in 2021 and looking forward, we really need to be taking a real-time adaptive approach. We need to be nimble. We need to be agile. Keep those things in mind. You need to be able to quickly analyze not just, I want to get a bit broader, not just the technical aspects of what you're doing, but the impact to the organization. What problem are you solving? What pain point are you addressing? What risk are you mitigating? And when you keep those things in mind and you kind of design a strategy to be able to react to quick dynamic changes in them, you're much more prepared to deal with the challenges of 2022 when it will come to your HCI deployments, your cybersecurity, all of these things. And, it's just like kind of thinking of a boxer or an athlete that, has to move a lot and do a lot. If you practice, if you exercise, if you train, you will be much more nimble and agile and efficient in your reaction and in the way that you proactively go after things. So I know I kind of use generalizations to answer a specific question, but the reason for that is because the question really kind of gave us a great segue into a broader discussion, because these things impact so much more than just HCI or just storage, just DR, just cybersecurity. The same principles can apply to your strategy around all of those.
Absolutely, John, and a great answer on that. One word from me for this one is, and it's something that we've all had to deal with recently, is Log4j. Real-time vulnerability assessments will help you with that. And when those types of threats pop up, there's going to be one next week, there's going to be one the week after. You have to be ready and stay on top of that. And your system is only as good as the operator behind the console. This is not a set it and forget it. When you have advanced threat protection, you're in there on a daily basis. You have dedicated IT professionals that are in there looking after that. This is not something you just sit back and wait for alerts to come back to you. You need to be proactive in regards to this. So the next one is check the new requirements for cyber insurance. We were talking about this over the last couple hours here, so I know that there's new requirements for cyber insurance that are brand new that I didn't know about, which was if you are going to be running outdated infrastructure that is no longer under warranty, maintenance, or security support by the vendor, you could have huge riders on your policies. So that's a big one. So, for example, you're going to run an outdated operating system that's no longer in support by the vendor. You could be in big trouble with that. You need to make attestations, because that could actually potentially void your policy. So my advice to you on the new cyber insurance requirements is really work with your vendors. You need to be open and transparent with them, because in the event that you do have a claim, remember, insurance companies are not in the business of paying out. They're in the business of for-profit insurance, and they're going to try to find ways to not have to pay out, because cyber insurance claims are typically in the significant high 6- and 7-figure payout volumes, and they're going to do everything in their power to not have to look after that. Because remember, most cyber insurance policies not only cover the IT infrastructure, there's also business downtime in there. There's also making sure that employees are going to get paid over, the Christmas break, because the entire company shut down and they don't have to go, without buying presents for their kids because they were all laid off 2 weeks before Christmas. And, that really hits home. And we need to make sure that those policies are buttoned up, okay? All right, the next big tip for 2022 is you need to plan 6 months in advance for your hyperconverged infrastructure projects. The procurement delays that we saw in 2021 were the longest procurement delays that I have ever seen in my 25 plus years in IT. We are seeing now delays where I think, John, we ordered servers that were back in September, and the balance of the parts showed up sometime in December. We were 120 days after everything was bought and paid for from actually receiving product due to procurement delays for a variety of reasons, network, silicon, chips, whatever it happens to be, flavor of the week. But if you're planning an HCI project for 2022 and you want to get that project going where gear is arriving in June, your ordering deadline is actually starting right now. You need to make sure you're planning for that right now, because if you want any hope of that gear showing up on time, you need to make sure that you're leaving yourself enough time inside of that window. Now, with that, with all of those procurement delays, John, this is a really great point for best practices and kind of real world tips for everyone. Is that now you can't get the hardware. You need to expand. You've run yourself out of space. You've run yourself out of processor memory, but now it's hard to get parts in. Do you look at this as an opportunity to go as more of a hybrid cloud approach where we can run some of that infrastructure in the cloud versus buying the new hardware or potentially moving it back on-prem when the hardware gets there? what are the choices that organizations have today in regards to either now migrating to the cloud or buying new hardware, especially thinking about those procurement delays?
So, Dave, this is great because I can actually use my answer to this to tie to your previous points, and that is that folks should absolutely be looking, designing, planning. Remember, agile, nimble that we talked about earlier, to leverage hybrid deployments, leverage those cloud resources and things like that. You talked about cybersecurity and outdated hardware. Well, guess what happens when you deploy in the cloud? When you use things like Azure SQL instances and that kind of thing, you don't have to worry about patching the underlying operating system. You don't have to worry about making sure that hardware is under warranty. You don't have to worry about the network backbone that powers it. It's taken care of. So if you have, say, one application that, the quality department in your organization uses, and they use it twice a year to produce some specific reports, or, maybe it's the health, safety, and environmental section of your organization, and they're doing some EPA reports if you live in the States, and they don't use that application very often, but you keep it on an application server. And because it's legacy, it doesn't play well with other applications, right? It's kind of like the grumpy old person that doesn't want to get along with others. So you kind of have this dedicated, aged application, and you're keeping it on some older hardware, and you've got to keep that hardware under warranty. You got to keep that server operating system patched and updated, and you got to keep that application updated and in the stack as well. Well, simply taking and migrating that off to the cloud would alleviate you of those underlying conditions, requirements, right? Maybe put it up in Azure Virtual Desktop scenario and be able to share it amongst multiple users running off of a single desktop license, and those kind of things. You can simplify your requirements, so we get into that point of being more efficient. I love removing tasks from IT friends and family so that they're able to focus on the other tasks, because the list seems never ending, and this is one way to do it.
Awesome. Okay, we talked about this in the previous session. The only one that I have to add to this is watch your cyber insurance, because, John, you raised a very valid point, which was migrating your old HCI servers and keeping them around for DR and labs. And this is just recent within the last couple of weeks that we're aware of this, is that make sure that if those things are off warranty and off maintenance and support, and or still living on your production networks, that you're not going to have some type of a cyber insurance rider that is going to, preclude you from taking and getting coverage because you're now running that out-of-date infrastructure. Because this used to be the norm for us, where we would take and we would repurpose, reuse that, and it might be fine. You just might have to run it in a separate, isolated network. But that's something you definitely want to talk to your cyber insurance vendors about now. Even if you boxed that back up and kept it for spares, as I mentioned earlier, make sure you're checking with your cyber insurance vendors to make sure that you're not going to have policy violations because you're bringing on non-supported gear. All right, so that was the same one. The next one is invest in your staff. Make sure that you get modern hyperconverged training and advanced infrastructure training for them. Some really great news for everyone is that Microsoft is actually come out now with their first on-prem trainings and exams for hybrid infrastructure in the last 5 to 6 years. And the exams are AZ800 and AZ801. Some fantastic training on, modern infrastructure from Microsoft, mostly focused on-prem and hybrid. And I highly advise that you look at that. There's a big HCI component inside of there. If you're working with other HCI vendors, make sure you stay up to date on their training and certification platforms. Our our teams only know what they know, and investing in your teams is a way that you'll make sure that you are successful for the future. All right, now a couple things. What not to do with HCI? I had to throw in a couple what not to do slides here, John, just because I love to do that. Number one is deduplication. Deduplication and Dave are no longer friends anymore. I would just prefer that you buy more storage. So buy the hardware that you need, buy the storage that you need. Like I mentioned, inside of our business, 98% of our Microsoft HCI related tickets are coming from deduplication issues, incorrectly configured, running yourself out of space, incompatibilities with the backup software, lockups, the list goes on and on. All of that goes away if we just don't use deduplication. I'm not saying that it's not right for all scenarios. There are good scenarios that deduplications are for, like static file servers, VDI instances. Definitely not for like Exchange workloads and high rate of transactions like OLTP or SQL servers. That's big. The second one is you don't want to take and put your giant file servers on premium storage like NVMe and SSD. You want to find some type of spinning disk solution for that, or better yet, don't be a data hoarder. The delete button exists on the keyboard. I'm going to tell you, if everybody watching this right now, if you look at your keyboard right now, there's a delete button on there. You can delete files. It is possible. You can do it. I have faith in everyone that's listening to this session right now that you can actually delete some of those files. Not everything is needed. You need to go through consolidation projects in 2022. Things like Azure files are a big help, where we can cloud and tier that off to the cloud, the data that's not being used. As long as it's available for archive, it's fine for most organizations. Get that into your project base for this year. And don't forget to set your antivirus exclusions for your HCI infrastructure. All right, John, what's up next? What are we seeing next for hyper-converged infrastructure? I'll pick a couple, and then I'll ask you a couple questions about these as we're looking to wrap up this wonderful last couple hours that we've been able to tune in with all of our live attendees here. So what's next for HCI solutions? I see more cloud integration coming. Fully cloud integrated and managed is huge. We've been striving for this for a long time. The vendors and the platforms that are out there, this is a huge focus, that utopia single pane of glass, regardless of cloud workload versus on-prem workload. Same interface, same training, same everything. We want to make sure that that innovation, like for example, that Microsoft is having for all of their Azure full cloud platform, that we're going to continue to see that inside of their on-prem version of that. Microsoft actually has a separate SKU. That's how big HCI is to Microsoft. They built a brand new SKU called Azure Stack HCI, been out in the market for about a little over a year now. And that's how Microsoft sees this. HCI is not going anywhere. And the other pieces of this is I honestly see that traditional three-tier infrastructure is going away. Like, as we keep pushing forward with HCI, this is not a fad. This is something that's going to be around for forever, because building hybrids, building on HCI, consolidating those platforms is really the future. And so, John, with that, I'll give you a few wrap-up thoughts, and then we can take a couple questions here.
Well, Dave, because I want to give everybody a chance to ask your question, and I know we only have a few minutes left, I really just want to emphasize one point that we got into here a bit, and that's related to the cyber insurance renewals. Keep in mind, everyone, that these companies, they're really working hard, whether they admit it or not, to find ways to not issue policies, to not pay on policies. And because of the level of attacks that we've seen over the last 24 months, they are really getting strict about so many things. Log4j, we talked about that. Many people may not realize that I've had conversations with cyber insurance carriers, large carriers. These are underwriters that write multi-million-dollar policies. and they're stating that, hey, they're putting in exclusions. So if you use a product that has Log4j, that gives them an out to not cover a claim on your network. You're going to have to work harder in 2022 than you've ever had to work before to make sure that you're doing what's necessary to keep in compliance, because the last thing you want is to have to answer questions about why after an event the company wasn't covered because we answered a question wrong or we, lied or that kind of thing. So keep up on that. And then I'll turn it back to you, Dave, so we can answer a couple questions.
All right. I think we've got time for at least one or two questions. We'll take one to start. We'll see where this takes us here. Kaylee had a great question. Kaylee's question was in regards to certifications in regards to hybrid infrastructure and hyperconverged. And the question was, are there any certifications that you'd recommend for a low to mid-level solution architect to give them a more well-rounded view of hybrid infrastructure? And that was that one that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Definitely look at, it's called AZ800, 800, or AZ801. Those are the two brand new Microsoft hybrid certifications and sets of training that you can go for. All right. Okay, so this is a good question from Anil. And John, I'll let you take this one, and then we'll wrap up from there and hand it back to David Rammel. How about the cost of implementation, including the cloud costs? So I think it's more around planning for that hybrid infrastructure and thinking about, what are the future cloud costs going to be and how organizations should look at that. So I'll give that one to you. If you have a minute, John, answer that, then we'll hand it back.
Thanks. So this is a great question, and one that I actually get involved in discussions around at least a few times a week. And so I want you to think of this. Different organizations are in different places where it comes to their preference between operational expense or capital expense. And so for some, they may have a lot of cash on hand, and it's more sensible for them to buy the on-premise resources like the HCI infrastructure, the clusters, the nodes. Others may be in a cash-strapped scenario where operational expense, where they're just kind of paying as they go for what they use and nothing more, and they're able to quickly scale up and scale down. Those are going to be organizations where they want to plan to use more of that hybrid infrastructure and the cloud-based resources. And so what you need to do is engage the business, engage the finance team, the executive team, understand where the business is positioned at the front of your project or at the front of your plans, and choose accordingly. So if they're in a position where they don't have the ability to do a lot of CapEx, it doesn't make sense to go out and ask for, a full-blown, let's redeploy everything on-prem kind of scenario. But likewise, if they're, in a good position to do that, you can really design that optimal scenario that takes advantage of both cloud-born resources and on-prem resources. And so I'll kind of be succinct and cut it off there and throw it back to you, Dave.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone, for attending. And with that, we'll pass it back over to our esteemed colleague, Mr. David Rammel.
Okay, great job, guys. Thanks for two great presentations and answering all those questions.